Hello, guys, and welcome to another episode of Thinking Out Loud. Our last episode, we did a little bit of coverage on the issues going on, the crisis going on in Israel, Palestine. But like we talked about, we chose to focus on a different angle as to why Israel is a rogue state. Obviously, we know that they're committing genocide in Palestine, in the Gaza Strip, with some of the most egregious crimes against humanity, I think, that any of us have seen in our lifetime in a digital age where it's being recorded and you have on the ground eyewitness testimony that's essentially beamed right into your head. You know, in our last episode, we discussed how Israel is a rogue regime in another way, with its harboring of criminals, with a long-standing policy of hiding sexual predators, war criminals, fraudsters, all the terrorists, all these different things. Today I'm going to be doing another brief video discussing some of the lies that have surrounded this war, this genocide in Palestine. So obviously October 7th happened, a massive insurgency uprising by Hamas and other pro-Palestine, Palestine liberation groups from across the political spectrum, coalition, but obviously with Hamas leading the charge in this. And around that, particularly with October 7th, we have seen Israeli news media, Western news media in general, particularly in U.S. imperial media, talking about the supposed atrocities, absolute horror show acts perpetuated by Hamas, right? Any of you that have been following this issue closely through independent media know that a lot of these lies have been dispelled, i.e. the case of Hamas apparently beheading 40 babies, and you even had Biden backing this up and making statements saying, I've seen photos. Most news agencies later came out and retracted this, saying that there was no proof, and it seems to have been a fabrication. All kinds of stories like mass gang rapes in Palestine and in Gaza of Hamas just apparently raping women in the street. Just terrible, terrible things that we're hearing out of the Israeli media, out of Israeli officials and U.S. media and officials as well, right? But as we know, a lot of that has been dispelled. So we're going to take some time here, and we'll try to do this video quicker like we did with the last one as well, to dispel more Israeli lies, particularly around the events of October 7th, right? So with October 7th, we heard that, you know, they broke through this quarantine wall, and they were just apparently indiscriminately massacring people at a EDM festival, the Nova Festival, which a little addendum here, but and I'm not trying to justify the murder of any innocent people, but I mean, you could obviously first off make a case, is anyone in a settler colony, particularly Israel, where people oftentimes have dual citizenship and they choose to be settler colonialists in Israel, you know, so is anyone in Israeli society truly innocent? You can make a case similar for the U.S., but that is a discussion, of course, for another time, and I'm not going to justify indiscriminate killing. But I do want to point out the sort of dystopic horror show of this Nova Festival is being hosted very near to the borders and defenses and quarantine zones of the Gaza Strip. So these people, in a sense, in Gaza, the Gaza Strip is a fucking open-air prison. It is a concentration camp. So there's something incredibly, to me, egregious and morally bankrupt of partying and dropping ecstasy and fucking dance around with your glow. I love dancing with glow sticks, but doing it next to a fucking concentration camp, I mean, if that isn't indicative of people living in the empire, I don't know what is. But anyway, before I go on a tangent, which I am notorious for, we're going to be discussing how a lot of these supposed atrocities or crimes against humanity, war crimes perpetuated by Hamas, are not only exaggerated, not only lies, but by and large, a lot of the civilians and horror show shit that happened on October 7th was a result of Israeli policy, right? So let's go ahead and jump into the reading here, guys. And again, we'll try to blow through this. I have 3 different articles, but we're going to try to blow through this quickly, so I'm sorry if it's kind of rapid fire, but again, we are trying to keep these videos shorter. So Israeli helicopter opened fire on Israelis in festival during Hamas talk on October 7th report. Report details contrary to Israeli official narrative about attack which claimed Hamas gunmen slaughtered revelers during the festival. This is out of Jerusalem, says, a new report revealed Saturday that an Israeli military helicopter opened fire on Palestinian gunmen, but wounded Israelis participating in a festival during an October 7th attack by Hamas against Israel. The Haaretz newspaper said an Israeli security assessment was based on an investigation by police with Hamas gunmen who were arrested October 7th. So they're getting this information from Hamas that have, I'm going to go ahead and assume, were fucking probably tortured beyond a belief if we know anything about the legacy or the reputation of the Israeli state, particularly their police and military, right? But I wanted to do some coverage on this because I had recently seen some things off Twitter that Netanyahu and his administration were talking about pulling funding from Haaretz. Haaretz is a Israeli newspaper for publishing this report, right? And I don't have the actual Haaretz report here because it's behind a paywall, but someone sent me this article here, which is essentially a copy and paste of it, right? So let's go on ahead. Let's go on ahead with the reading here, guys. It says, it said, according to the assessment, the gunman had no prior information about the festival, which was held close to Kibbutz Re'im, near the borders with Gaza. So another little addendum here. I have heard the stuff about this, and I absolutely cannot verify it. So grain of salt, many grains of salt here, guys. I had heard that this festival had been moved last minute. And if that does check out, it would make sense that maybe these gunmen, Hamas had no idea that this was going to be happening, right? Anyway, let's go on here. It says, Israel's Yedioth newspaper also published a report on Israeli Air Force helicopters intervening in the attack carried out by Hamas from Gaza on October 7th. The newspaper reported that the Israeli forces found it difficult to identify Hamas militants, of course, because you have just crowds of people. It's chaos. This is a war zone. And the fact that you're going to dispatch military helicopters with Hellfire missiles and the whole spread to an area that you know is densely populated instead of responding on the ground with forces and armored vehicles and stuff more initial. I mean, it's just crazy. These helicopters and stuff like this are weapons of mass destruction. They are not surgical, quote-unquote, surgical military tools, right? The Hamas terrorists were instructed to slowly blend in with the crowd and not to move under any circumstances. So keep in mind with this, too, guys, some of this stuff is like, you know, it is interesting to see an Israeli newspaper or Israeli sources, and some of the other articles, it'll be Israeli hostages coming out and telling the truth, or maybe even in some cases having more of a Freudian slip with some of these officials. But still keep in mind, these publications will still spin it in such a way to maintain the overall narrative of this being a just war for the Israeli war, again, for the Israeli government, right? In this way, this is an example of that, obviously. In this way, they tried to fool the Air Force into believing that those below were Israelis. This deception worked for a while until the Apache helicopters, again, American-made helicopters, American-made weapons perpetuating this genocide, had to break free of all restraints. The pilots found it difficult to distinguish who was a terrorist and who was an Israeli, the report added. The newspaper said that when they realized that, some of them decided to use artillery shells against the terrorists independently without getting permission from their superiors. Okay, so this is an actual lie. And we will see in one of the later articles from Israeli officials how the higher-ups, the command in that region, did give them the green light to indiscriminately kill, to use these weapons of more mass destruction, mass killing, rather than doing more of a surgical operation, which you think would make sense in regards to handling a terror situation that from its, and I don't call it a terror situation, but a militant operation focused on getting hostages. You know there's going to be hostages. You know there's a lot of hostages. You know, you think that you respond in a more surgical way, but these commanders, contrary to what's being said here in this article, did give them the green light for indiscriminate killing, essentially, right? Going on here, says, police estimated the number killed at the festival was 364. Of course, the investigation details are contrary to the official Israeli narrative on the attack by the Palestinian resistance group, which claimed Hamas gunmen slaughtered the revelers in the festival. And, like, look, I'm going to give an addendum here as well. an asterisk. I'm sure there was some indiscriminate killing because it's a war zone. It's fucking chaos. But as we'll see in some of these later articles, and if you just look at this whole thing zoomed out, obviously, Hamas is a guerrilla military organization, political organization. First off, it's not a terrorist group. It was democratically elected in Palestine to administer the sort of quasi-state, unfortunately, that Palestine is. But obviously the West, Israel, refused to recognize that democratic election because they don't want, first off, they don't want Palestinians to have any autonomy, but they especially don't want a more militant group, you know, in charge in Palestine. And then, of course, we could have a discussion about how Hamas was initially backed to rise up against Yasser Arafat during this time period several years back because they wanted a more militant organization. Anyway, that's a discussion for another time, and I'm sure it's stuff that you've already been hearing about. But getting off track here, again, the point of this operation, Hamas is a militant organization. It is the largest militant organization in Palestine for decolonization, for anti-imperialism, but it is still incredibly small in terms of scale to the Israeli military machine and the Israeli state, and of course, the Israeli military machine and state being backed by the much larger U.S. empire, right? Hamas knows they weren't breaking out of Gaza, the quarantine Gaza, the concentration camp of Gaza, to lay siege to the Israeli state with any hopes of winning. This is not what this was about. This was about getting hostages, right, in order to barter with the Israeli state for certain demands for Palestinians. And as we've seen more recently with the hostage exchange, one of those being to release hostages that are being held by Palestinian hostages that are being held by the Israeli state. Many of them, as we have seen, were fucking children and women and had absolutely no affiliation with any sort of militant organization going on in Palestine, right? So that's what we have here, guys. Just a little bit of coverage from that, but I'm going to jump into some more details with this through the gray zone. So I have this article here. Says Israeli October 7th poster child was killed by Israeli tank, eyewitnesses reveal. This is from people on the ground. So you guys may have remembered this story just surging through all news media, all Western news media, about this little girl apparently being killed by Hamas. And it was used as an example by Netanyahu, all these different officials, of how bloodthirsty and inhumane, absolute savages Hamas is. They use this as the justification, again, to do the operation that they have been, this genocidal carpet bombing in Gaza. But as we're going to find out, she was not killed by Hamas. She was killed by the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces. All right, so let's go ahead and jump into the reading here for this article. Again, I will try to keep it as brief as possible, give you the tidbits. So again, this is from the Gray Zone, Max Blumenthal. Obviously, you know of him. Eyewitnesses to the October 7th hostage standoff in Kibbutz Be'eri have exposed Israel for misleading the world about the killings of 12-year-old Liel Hetzroni, her family, and her neighbors. In a desperate bid for international sympathy, the Israeli government has sought to stir outrage over the killing of a 12-year-old girl during the Hamas-led attack on southern Israel on October 7th. This little girl's body was burned so badly that it took forensic archaeologists more than 6 weeks to identify her. This is quote-unquote, the Israeli Foreign Ministry declared on its official Twitter/X account. All that remains of 12-year-old Liel Hetzroni is ash and bone fragments. May her memory be a blessing. And you can see this tweet here from the Israeli Foreign Ministry. So first off, one of the things we hear about with October 7th is, again, like I pointed out, Hamas, their whole purpose in this was to try to get hostages. But we hear from the Israeli officials from Western media that they just went in and did indiscriminate killing. And then during this relatively small window of time, did indiscriminate killing, took hostages, burned people in their houses, and all these different things, right? When you look at that, when you zoom out and look at that, and you look at all these things in relation, you start to ask questions right away. It's like, what is the purpose of indiscriminate killing when you're trying to take hostages, right? What is the purpose, and where and when do you find the time or resources or tools necessary to burn entire kibbutzes, to burn people in their vehicles, when your sole purpose is to try to get these hostages so that you can negotiate for certain demands, right? But we'll get more information about this here. It says, Liel Hetzroni was among the non-combatants killed in Kibbutz Be'eri when the small southern Israeli community was momentarily taken over by Hamas militants seeking captives to spur a prisoner exchange. Again, like I said, during the standoff that ensued, she was killed instantly alongside her twin brother, great aunt, and several other residents at Be'eri. However, the 12-year-old Hetzroni was not slain by Hamas, according to a new testimony by an Israeli eyewitness to the girl's death. She was killed by an Israeli tank shell alongside several neighbors. The revelation of Hetzroni's friendly fire death came as the government of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu attempts to shut down the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, this is what I was talking about earlier, for reporting that Israeli Apache helicopters killed Israeli citizens fleeing the Nova Electronic Music Festival on October 7th. Haaretz reporting confined a viral gray zone investigation which highlighted disclosures by Israeli helicopter pilots and security officials of friendly fire orders throughout the fateful day. In another gray zone article, we can touch on how a lot of these images that you saw, burned out buildings, burned out cars, people just melted to death into the concrete. How is terrorists with limited supplies and oftentimes very primitive small arms and munitions going to inflict this much death? I mean, it doesn't even check out. Of course, Israel is known for its cartoonish propaganda, but it's just really shocking to see it so front and center when they're so disproportionately killing human beings, and then they try to paper it over with not even a fucking Band-Aid, like with a little pimple patch, you know? The commanders in the field made difficult decisions. Okay, so again, earlier we talked about that other article, the one for Haaretz. It's still running flack for the Israeli state, even though it's revealing that there was a friendly fire situation. Why is it doing that? First thing I want to say there, it is doing that because while all of the Israeli state and essentially all of the Israeli population, not all, I'm sure, but the majority culturally, politically, people are on board with this genocide in Gaza against Palestinians because they don't look at Palestinians as human beings. They look at them as subhuman because the Israeli state is an ethno-state built on essentially white supremacy, in this case Jewish supremacy, right? So you do have that. You have all the Israelis on board, across the board, with this genocide, with this operation, right? But it is still a quote-unquote democracy, a liberal, a bourgeois democracy, and there are political schisms within the Israeli state between the more liberal Israelis, the more super far right, even more far right than Netanyahu, the far right that is Netanyahu, and then the more traditional conservative. I mean, just like in U.S. politics, right? It's my idea that Haaretz is publishing this because there is a lot of outcry against Netanyahu for his handling of October 7th. They're like, why did this happen? Why did you respond this way? People in Israeli society know that the hostage deal, which has led to a ceasefire last week that we are hearing about, they know that this deal has been on the table since day one. So Haaretz is probably publishing this while still running flack for the overall operation, as a way to sort of dig or take on Netanyahu's administration, right? But this is what I talked about. That other article, running flack, lied in saying that individual GIs, government issues, soldiers in the IDF, made the call themselves to fire, right? Putting the blame on the individual. But as we see here in this, a member of the security team that was involved in Kibbutz Be'eri told Haaretz that the commanders in the field made difficult decisions, including shelling houses on their occupants in order to eliminate the terrorists along the hostages. So here we see a contradiction, an open lie or half-truth. The commanders in the field, right? A tank battalion commander right here recalled saying, I arrived in Be'eri to see Brigadier General, this is not a low man on totem pole, Barak Haram, and the first thing he asked me to do is to fire a shell into the house where Hamas members were sheltering. So again, another lie. This is a very high up IDF official, officer, giving the call to fire into a house that they know there are civilian hostages. And of course, this is happening because I'm sure most of you that have been following this issue have heard about how Israel has the Hannibal Directive, which was put in place, I believe, back in the early 2000s. The Hannibal Directive tells the IDF to kill everyone involved, even if there's Israeli hostages, right? And we'll have more information on that later. Among them was the girl whose death has been weaponized to justify Israel's brutal assault on Gaza. When those 2 shells hit, Leal stopped screaming. Yasmin Porat was among the Israelis taken hostage by Hamas militants in Be'eri on October 7th. She had fled the Nova Electronic Music Festival and sought shelter in the community when the militants arrived. In a November 15th interview with the Israeli national broadcaster Kanz News. So again, all this stuff, you can be like, oh, well, it's gray zone, it's left media, blah, blah, blah. It's like all the stuff that they are citing here is coming out of official reports and mainstream media for that region, right? Porat provided exclusive details of the standoff, which badly undercut her government's official narrative. Give me 1 second here, guys. Okay. I sat there with the commander of the unit, Porat recalled, and I described to him what the house looks like and where the terrorists are and where the hostages are. So she's giving them all this information. They know there are hostages in there. I actually drew it for him. Look here on the lawn where the 4 hostages, blah, blah, blah. Porat explained, I told the Israeli commander, about the twins Yanai and Leal Hatzroni. Told them that there was young children in the house and their great aunt Ayala. By 4 p.m., a gun battle began to rage between the militants inside the home and the Israeli special forces stationed across the street. After failing to dislodge the Hamas fighters, the Israelis called in a tank 730. Talks about the shooting of shells, mini shells, into the house. When the dust cleared, only Hadass Dagan emerged from the house alive. What a fucking trip it must be to come out of that. I mean, the only one alive. Porat said Dagan later told her, Yasmin, when the 2 big booms hit, I felt like I flew in the air. It took me 2 to 3 minutes to open my eyes. I didn't feel my body. I was completely paralyzed when I opened my eyes. I saw these people were dead. Dagan confirmed that the tank shells killed Leal Hastroni. The girl did not stop screaming for all those hours, she told Porat, referring to Leal. She didn't stop screaming, but when those 2 shells hit, Leal stopped screaming. I mean, I don't really have... I can't imagine that situation, and I'm not sympathizing with settlers in this genocidal society, but these children are always innocent, you know, and insane, man. Dagan emphasized to Porat that none of the hostages had been intentionally killed. There were no, by the Hamas fighters. None of the hostages had been intentionally killed by the Hamas fighters. There were no executions or anything like that, at least not the people with her. In a separate interview on October 15th, Porat insisted the Palestinian militants did not abuse us. They treated us very humanely. So that is testimony we are hearing again and again and again and again from Israelis being held captive by Hamas, that they are treated with the utmost respect. They were fed. We had some elderly women that were released 1 or 2 weeks into the Israeli operation in Gaza, and they talked about how, you know, deeply sympathetic the Hamas. I mean, we are hearing this time and time again. This is not Hamas propaganda. This is coming from Israelis. Here we have another example of it, obviously. But it is clear that the Israeli decision to shell the home with tanks wound up killing almost everyone inside, including the child who has become a centerpiece of Israel's international anti-Hamas propaganda campaign. So that's the thing with this, guys. It's not just the horror show of engaging in this Hannibal Directive, the Israeli IDF engaging in the Hannibal Directive to not give a fuck about hostages of their own people, friendly fire, killing indiscriminately, excessive use of force. Obviously, not just what we're seeing in Gaza, but during the initial operation where they're firing into civilian homes. They do not give a fuck. What do you expect from a society that's built on genocide, right? That is pushed culturally from all perspectives to be violent and xenophobic and supremacist in its nature. But on top of that, this is what is so fucking egregious and hellish and inhuman about this is they use this little girl's death cynically to justify the murder of 8,000 fucking children in the Gaza Strip, right? It just shows you the nature of the Israeli state, the nature of the Israeli officials that are running this society, to use the death of a 12-year-old girl to justify fucking genocide, right? Insane. All right, guys, so this next article is also from Gray Zone. I'm going to really plow through this one because we're already probably running about 30 minutes, and I unfortunately have to go to work, but it's just more examples of how the Israeli government lied, the IDF lied about what caused the death toll on October 7th and how, in fact, the IDF was largely responsible for a lot of these civilian deaths here. So let's go ahead and jump into this here, guys. Again, Gray Zone. This is a, what do you call it? A readout or transcript of a podcast with Chris Hedges. I don't know if you watch the Chris Hedges report, where Max Blumenthal was on there discussing his more recent article and evidence that he had showing the amount of friendly fire perpetuated by the IDF on its own people, right? So we'll just jump into this here quick. I want to touch on this quickly because this is the Hannibal Directive, which many of you may have heard of, some of you haven't. Israel in 1986, so I was way off with the date there, I apologize for that, instituted a military policy called the Hannibal Directive, apparently named for the Carthaginian general who poisoned himself rather than be captured by the Romans following the capture of 2 Israeli soldiers by Hezbollah. The directive is designed to prevent Israeli troops from falling into enemy hands through the maximum use of force, even at the cost of killing the captured soldiers and civilians. The directive was executed during the 2014 Israeli assault on Gaza known as Operation Protective Edge. Hamas fighters on August 1st, 2014, captured an Israeli soldier, Lieutenant Hadar Golden. In response, Israel dropped more than 2,000 bombs, missiles, and shells. 2,000 over a hostage situation. And shells in the area where he was being held. Goldan was killed, along with over 100 Palestinian civilians. Excessive force is a war crime, mind you. The directive was supposedly rescinded in 2016. Let's see here. What else do we have? So again, I touched on this, but the official story has been told to Americans and Israeli that Hamas terrorists, quote unquote, stormed into southern Israel and began shooting and killing people at random, then burned them alive, tied up entire families in their homes, and then burned them all somehow. Melted cars and burned people in their cars as they were trying to flee and carried out this gigantic mass shooting. And again, for Max Blumenthal here, like I said earlier, it's important to understand that the main goal in this Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad military offensive was to gather as many captives as possible, particularly Israeli soldiers, in order to trigger the prisoner exchange that was witnessed with Gilad Shalit in 2011 was released. The Israeli soldier who was taken in 2006, who was operating a tank outside Gaza, was taken in exchange for 1,027 Palestinian prisoners, including the current Prime Minister of Gaza, Yahweh Sinwar. So yes, this is what I was saying. This was the point of the whole Hamas operation, was to be more of a surgical strike, to come in, get in as quick as possible, get out as quick as possible with as many hostages as possible so that you can negotiate for the thousands of political prisoners that Israel has in their prisons. Right. And that's why we are seeing this hostage exchange now. And this is why they were asking for this hostage negotiation immediately after the operation, right? So again, here we have evidence that this was not just indiscriminate killing decisions made by individual Israeli soldiers. It was called for by high-up officials, like we saw with the brigadier general operating that tank division. So talking about this area that was overrun, so that was immediately overrun by gunmen as a military target, and with all those soldiers inside, the head of the Gaza division actually went into an underground bunker. He recounted the story to Haaretz and made the tough decision to bomb a Rez crossing, and they sent Hellfire missiles onto the Rez crossing from Apache helicopters. And this was basically the beginning of the Iron Swords operation that Netanyahu declared several days later, which is essentially the carpet bombing of Gaza. Another addition to this here, guys, says, talking about Kibbutz Be'eri, which we talked about in that earlier article, and yet they were told to empty their tanks, completely unload their ammo, then head back to base, get filled up again, reload, and then go shoot as many cars and people as they could on the ground. Does that sound like you're trying to stop terrorists? That is not how you stop quote-unquote terrorists. That is horrendous. They don't care who they kill, even their own people. Then this is talking about some of the evidence here for why they believe it was Hellfire missiles, right? And not Hamas somehow burning people, melting cars into concrete. But then you have all these images that the Israeli Foreign Ministry put out of cars that are completely melted and their corpses inside are charred. And those to me are telltale signs of Hellfire missile strikes from Apache helicopters and the Apache crews, the squadrons. They put out a video afterward of themselves shooting cars, hitting cars with Hellfire missiles, and shooting people who were pedestrians walking on the ground with cannon fire. So I'm going to go ahead and tie this off here, guys. And we'll just leave the rest of the reading because we're going long enough here. But I just wanted to give you these examples, this evidence of a large number of the people killed on October 7th that Israel is using as justification to kill what now? 20,000 people in Palestine were a result of their own response operation. Indiscriminate killing, this Hannibal directive. And this is just another example, several examples of Israel being caught in its propaganda lies. It's just ridiculous the way that they will get on and lie and lie and lie. And they are not even good lies. They are terrible lies, right? And they consistently get dispelled. So I just wanted to do some more Palestine coverage for you guys and give you an example of how, you know, in a lot of ways that obviously what we're seeing with all these pro-Palestine actions across the world, even in the imperial core of the United States, Israel is losing the ideological war, the propaganda war on this because their propaganda department is dog shit, right? And we need to be clear that Israel is not the fucking victim in this. They are a settler colony that is hell-bent on ethnic cleansing, like we're seeing in the Gaza Strip, like we saw in the Nakba, like we have seen every few years in Gaza and in the West Bank for decades since the country's inception, right? And we see that they are even willing to kill their own people for political expediency of this whole settler colonial project, right? So again, guys, that's all I have for you. Thanks for watching. Again, I'm going to try to do these shorter videos, try to get them out more to you more quickly, maybe 2 or 3 times a week if I'm able to. So if you enjoyed this content, please like, please subscribe. Let's get this channel growing. We're entering into a new era of the Entitled Millennials, and I'm feeling really positive about it. Let's keep it rolling. Don't forget that you can support my independent media work on Patreon at patreon.com/entitledmillennials. You can support me there for $1 a month. You will not miss it, but if everybody watching this episode gives $1, hell, I'm a fucking YouTuber, right? Other than that, you can do one-time PayPal donations at paypal.me/entitledmillennials. Those are always greatly appreciated. You guys have saved my ass with those in the past. But as always, guys, it's great hanging out with you. I love talking the issues with you, and I look forward to speaking again with you soon.